and that became a war in which the United States and Europe were able to use Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia, both in the war effort in Ukraine, but more generally in its economy and its military.
How did you achieve that? I mean, what is your assess?
Well, we
Do
didn't,
they achieve that?
We didn't actually. I think Russia did not come out of this weakened. I think its economy proved far more resilient than most had expected.
So, Mr. Beebe, thank you so much for being with us and for joining us on this forum. It's very important to have all of you here, and especially you, and to have this opportunity to share the ideas, the thoughts you have with us. So first of all, I would like to have a kind of short conversation on the issue of proxy wars and emerging multipolarity. How that can be the kind of driver of new proxy wars. And why? Because the multipolarity is the kind of the possible result of the ending unipolar moment. So the unipolar moment is the kind of the reason why this Russia and the West has this kind of confrontation in Ukraine, etc. But what is more important that everyone understands that it's impossible to have the big fight between big powers. I mean, a big World War III, big nuclear war. Everyone understands it. In my concern, I do think that that drives to new proxy wars because of they can't fight each other directly. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's right. I think essentially the Ukraine war came about because the United States was attempting to take the West, the NATO Europe structure, and expand that to become the basis for the broader global order. And the Russians said no.
Yeah.
We're not going to live in a world in which European security is dominated by NATO, in which Russia does not have a say, in which the structure of the world order that the United States is advancing actually has no place in it for Russia and threatens Russia's interests. So the Russians said no, and they said no with force because the West essentially was not accepting Russia's pleas to compromise on this issue diplomatically. Now, Russia expected this war would be over very quickly.
Yeah.
They did not think this would turn into a proxy war. But I think what happened was the United States intelligence gathered so much information about Russia's plans that we were able to tell the Ukrainians, here's what the Russians are going to do, here's where they're going to strike and when, and that helped the Ukrainians prepare defenses, and Russia's initial attempt to seize the capital in Kiev failed. And at that point, this turned into a proxy war, because the Russians knew they weren't going to win very quickly. It wasn't going to be over in a few weeks. And it settled into a war of attrition. And that became a war in which the United States and Europe were able to use Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia, both in the war effort in Ukraine, but more generally in its economy and its military.
How did you achieve that? I mean, what is your assess?
Well,
Do they achieve that?
We didn't actually. I think Russia did not come out of this weakened. I think its economy proved far more resilient than most had expected. Its military has actually geared up. You know, the Russians have imposed a war economy in which they are producing more artillery shells every month than Ukraine, Europe, and the United States combined. So that part has failed. But strategically, I think this has been a failure for Russia because it has resulted in cutting off Russia from the West. It has reinforced Russian dependence on China, and the Russians don't like that.
Yeah.
You know, they want it to be a great power. They need to be able to balance their relations with China and the West so that they have alternatives. They have bargaining power with the Chinese. The Chinese can't simply dictate what price they'll buy oil and gas from Russia from. So I think the Russians strategically find themselves in a corner and they want out, and that's part of the reason why they, I think, do in fact want a diplomatic settlement of the war in Ukraine.
Yes, you're right. So, and what do you think about finally, so we are facing kind of emerging, a lot of people say that it's an emerging multipolarity. The unipolar moment has been ended so far. So for instance, the Professor mentioned and many other scholars say that the unipolar moment has been ended. But on the other hand, what is really emerging? Is it really multipolarity or bipolarity between US and China? Whether Russia has real power to be the independent global power, independent center of global power?
Well, I think that the answer to that is it's unclear. It's very clear that the unipolar moment is over. It's very clear that a new order is emerging. Will it in fact be multipolar? Will it be some variation of bipolarity? I don't think that has been answered yet. With the end of World War II, when we structured the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, the idea was the victorious powers of World War II would be represented, and it would essentially be a multipolar order among those great powers. Well, very quickly it became clear that there were really only 2 great powers, and England and France were really subsidiaries of the United States. China became very weak. And ultimately became part of the Eastern world. And so we had a bipolar order rather than that multipolarity. The same thing could happen today. But it's by no means foreordained. Part of this is going to depend on whether Europe can rise to the challenges that it faces right now. Part of it is going to depend on whether Russia can end the war in Ukraine and restore economic growth and dynamism and become the great power that it wants to be. And I think it's actually in the United States' interests for Russia to be one of these great powers. Because the alternative,
China,
the alternative would be Russia alliance with China. I don't think that's good for us.
Yeah, it's a nightmare. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
From the U.S. perspective, yes. And finally, what do you think? Since the 4 years of this war in Ukraine, what is the end game of the West? I believe that it is already kind of separated, US end game and Europe's end game. Probably they're not so united in this understanding of the end game. What is, in your point of view, what their end game in this war?
Well, I think it's very strongly in America's interest for this war to end in a compromise settlement. One that Russia buys into, one which protects Ukraine's sovereignty and its ability to rebuild, reconstruct, and be a viable independent state. And Europe, I think, is threatened by that prospect because I think the Europeans worry that Europe has focused on expansion. It's focused on being a regulatory body and taking EU laws and values and spreading them eastward.
Yeah.
And a compromise settlement of the war of Ukraine would put an end to that purpose. So Europe is left asking itself, well, what are we? If we're not expanding the borders of the EU and spreading our values, what are we supposed to be doing? Europe is threatened by that question, and so it doesn't want to see a compromise end to this war. It's more comfortable trying to extend the status quo for as long as possible. I think that's a mistake. I think it will end up hurting Europe quite severely if this war doesn't come to an end soon.
Mr. Beebe, thank you so much for your time and for being with us.
You're welcome.
Wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.